Hello friends and sunflowers, my name is Elena and welcome to my channel. On the surface, Enhypen's Drunk-Dazed music video looks like a group of teenage vampires and supernaturals partying and having fun at what they refer to as their bloody birthday party, goading their werewolf frenemies from a rival school and then getting impossibly drunk and a little bit dazed. But as always with pretty much every music video under Hybe labels, things are not quite so simple. We see flashbacks to their early life which mirrors their debut music video Given Taken, and more sinister underlying tones that make you wonder why exactly they have so much blood on their hands. That and its continuous criticism towards the idol industry, the constant references to Shakespeare, and of course, the references to the Hybe universe which prove that this music video is a lot more than what you see right on the surface. I want to state right away that while I am going to be talking a little bit about the idol industry towards the end of this video, all of this is completely covering the fictional storyline based on Enhypen, which they've named Dark Moon, and in no way will it reflect the actual group or the relationships between any of the members in real life. So close your eyes, take a deep breath, and let's dive beyond the border together. The Invitation. Not only is this the title of the intro for this album, which I did a whole breakdown earlier on, but vampires actually need an invitation to enter a building, and I mean Enhypen are very clearly vampires. This is actually really old, common vampire lore. I'm pretty sure most of you are familiar with it. So it's no surprise that this music video starts with them holding an invitation, which then gets picked up by an unknown girl, but we'll get to that later. On this invitation, it says, "You're invited to our bloody birthday party. Sometimes walking down the deadly path without fleeing from death itself can give rise to the most wondrous creation. We hope you'll be able to come." Sinister implications, definitely intriguing. We'll get to what that means in just a moment. But first, this isn't the only invitation that we see from Enhypen. In fact, I wager that this isn't even the first invitation period that Enhypen has sent out, but it's simply their own way of continuing the tradition of invitations. After all, they got one before, a long time ago, in their perspective most likely. So what is that invitation? Well, at the end of the 2020 Mama performance, we saw an invitation addressed to Enhypen, which invited them to the carnival. This read, "Dear Enhypen, I welcome you all who have finally arrived here after traveling on a long road. Life and death mix, up and down flip, a grand carnival where order has overthrown time. Everyone is invited. We wait for the day we will meet. Sincerely, yours." This letter, I imagine, might have been the first, at least for Enhypen. They followed this invitation to a castle, which we see in the animations for the intros and the outros, where they are told they can take everything. This leads to the up version of the Border Carnival albums, where they're clearly high status, and yet they still have reflections, which we know in this universe vampires do not have reflections. And then we see in the music video, they seem to undergo some sort of ceremony in front of this girl as she drops blood towards the ground. This is likely the time that they became vampires, and as Greek lore suggests, this woman might be Selene, and they might be the first vampires. This moment, of course, mirrors the fountain scene with Sunu almost exactly, where the girl would be the top of the fountain and the boys would stand where the water would be. Interestingly, Shakespeare actually referenced fountains, but specifically in regards to the passing of one's parentage. This was in the play Macbeth, where he basically wrote that the fountain of your blood had stopped. The very source of it stopped. This indicated that the character's father had died. Considering that this woman that we see does seem to give them life as a vampire, and of course their frequent references to Shakespeare, I wouldn't be surprised if they have to keep blood flowing through the fountain in order to keep their youth and vampirism just in general, and their powers, of course. In a way, this is sort of like a fountain of youth for them, which might in fact be why we do see Sunu bathing in it. And so, this is of course why in their modern recreation, Sunu instead pours his own blood into the fountain, mimicking her actions and adding weight to the words they wrote in their own invitation, which, of course, was very similar to the original one. Sometimes walking down the deadly path, without fleeing from death itself, can give rise to the most wondrous creation. The path they must take, the promise of facing and defeating death, and of course the knowledge that the boys were once turned into vampires after receiving one such invitation of their their own, leads me to believe that the overall goal of this entire invitation and party and carnival is, of course, to turn people into vampires. The intention is clear. They are following this tradition and thus keeping the fountain flowing. And make sure you keep this in mind, because I'm going to come back to this later, because I think it's going to be a point of contention within the story for the group. But of course, this whole idea could be why in the lyrics they say, "Call me out from across the line, everything changes, everything crumbles, I reach past the locked door, pain welcomes me, a feast of thirst." The flowing of blood for this fountain is what stops the call from beyond the line, which of course I'm assuming in this case the line they're talking about is that between life and death. In this instance anyways, I think they use this whole imagery several times over with different meanings. Of course, this is what stops them from changing and crumbling like the lyrics suggest. Or rather, even when they do crumble, there is still blood flowing through the fountain. Death once dead, there's no dying then, I believe they said. Throughout the music video, we get scenes that parallel Give and Taken, where it looks like Jungwon is blowing out the candles for the first time, their first party, and now they have 6 candles. This places Give and Taken somewhere after they returned, but before they had fully come into their vampirism and all of their powers. They're still discovering their vampire selves, I guess. And of course, adding to the intrigue that Give and Taken has always produced, but this isn't really the video for that. I'm not sure exactly how they count time, or rather I can't be 100% sure, but I do kind of assume that every candle on this cake represents 1 century or 100 years. The Carnival of Venice, which I'm assuming the carnival that they were talking about originally, because of all the Italian, was based on, did originally start within approximately the 12th century, but as math dictates, I could see this happening around the 15th century. However, the clothes they're wearing was actually inspired by the 18th century, so... And just to add to the fact that we have no idea what time is, Shakespeare existed towards the end of the 16th century, which is 100 years off, so. But it's not the first time they've had weird time stuff going on. I mean, Give and Taken looked like it happened somewhere in the past, and I mean, they had battery-powered flashlights, so. I don't know, maybe vampire fashion is just 300 years into the future. I don't make the rules, time is weird. You know, up and down or flipped and all whatever that says. However, this actually might be explainable too. I'm guessing that the universe that Give and Taken takes place in is actually Magic Island, or at least some sort of mixed version of Magic Island and reality, which we've recently figured out might be a digital world. In Give and Taken, the world actually glitches, similar to how it does with TXT in their Doom's Night animation, which I theorize happens in a combined state of reality and fantasy. This actually might be how the down version of the concept photos connects to all of this as well. A dream, a mixing of realities. It's all mixed up, shall we say. Okay, even I know that one was bad. Perhaps, though, this is why the past that we see in Give and Taken seems directly tied to the present that we're seeing during Drunk-Dazed. They're mixed up. And to even further this idea, towards the end of this music video, we see an interesting shift towards their understanding of reality, where Sungwon is seen lying in blood thanks to the fountain, but is then taken back to the same room at the very end where he's lying there now with the others. I'm not exactly sure how this ties everything together, but there's definitely some mixing of time and perception of events and reality and metaphors. And of course, remember that I've previously theorized that the carnival happens outside of time itself, so things happening at the same time just kind of makes sense. Well, those, and of course, as I mentioned before, the mixing of realities, which is an idea no thanks to, of course, the existence of wormholes. Okay, so it's not actually shown in this music video, which is sort of surprising, but it is in fact the outro of this album, and thus it is very important and something that we should definitely take into account. In the lyrics for Outro Wormhole, it says, "The perfectly square mirror reveals a twisted scene. In that dream, I face a completely different me." There's a lot of things to unpack in these 3 lines alone, not to mention the whole rest of the album, so please bear with me as I try to make sense of this with you. First, let's start with the whole dream aspect, since, I mean, we were kind of just talking about that. Magic Island, as I mentioned, happens in a digital space, but part of the rules to get there involve closing your eyes. Add that to the fact that TXT actually referred to it as a dream, matched with the images of a tunnel, which is also referenced at the end of Outro Wormhole. TXT also use mirrors as wormholes, and of course, they view events through the wormhole, much like they're suggesting in the lyrics here. So yeah, it's really similar to TXT's Doom's Night and how the wormholes work there, so it's very consistent. Likewise, in terms of mirrors, I also describe Magic Island as being something that like mirrors back your subconscious to you, same way that a dream would. Another line in the outro does actually add to this. And yet when most I wink, then do mine eyes best see the unknown. Shakespeare's sonnet number 43 is titled When Most I Wink, Then Do Mine Eyes Best See, which this clearly references. The sonnet itself talks about dreams and day and night and youth while in dreams, which of course happens at night. Dreams happen in the night. This sounds pretty familiar and is really similar to Enhypen. And of course, just dreams in general are a recurring theme in the Hybe universe. But even with Enhypen's outro cross the line from their previous album, Border Day 1, it said, "If I wake from a dreamless sleep, may tomorrow begin like a dream." Which, to remind you, was them going to a castle where the first carnival took place. And of course, in the animation on that line, we had what appeared to be the death of the main character, only to have that person sit up and smile with fangs in their mouth. Anyways, in Enhypen's Let Me In, we see them physically traversing through a wormhole, which, as I mentioned, is perfectly square. By the way, it is important to note that while I do think that this is digital in a digital space, or possibly a VR type space, as we've seen previously, like in the down version or in the What Do You Believe In videos, I do in fact believe that it's completely real events that are happening in the story. Just because it's in a digital space doesn't mean that it's not happening. Also, remember the scene that we see at the end with Sungwoon? It reveals a twisted scene. So it's possible that what's happening at the end of the music video is what they're seeing through the wormhole, a twisted scene, a different reality. It's unclear if this is actually something that happened or not, or if it simply happened in another reality where they look at themselves and don't recognize themselves, like the lyrics suggest. In theory, it's possible there's a reality out there where they're human, and only in this digital space are they actually vampires. But like I said, that doesn't make it any less real. Sunwoo himself was in fact paralleling the scene in which the boys actually became vampires, which is possibly an alternate reality instead of the past, even though it's framed as the past in this situation. Which, considering we did end up having the scene where he pours it into the fountain, makes me wonder if the attendees of their party did indeed face death head on. I mean, we don't actually see any indication of what happens after Sunwoo leaves. We don't even get any closure as to what happens between him and Kay, the werewolf that follows him. I'll get into the werewolves just in a little bit. But as of course they said in the letter, and I mentioned, the point of this party was to, of course, give rise to the most wondrous of creations, which are vampires in this particular case. Although there's still the possibility of like weird hybrid things, which maybe that's why he talked to the werewolves. I mean... So while in the music video it does seem to end with them lying in the room the next morning, I also wanted to bring another line from the outro to your attention. Multiple dimensions wait for us. There might be a world where day and night coexist. Where day and night coexist. What have I been talking about? Okay, adding to the already mentioned Shakespeare line, this adds an extra just amount of intrigue for me. Since Shakespeare did actually talk about the differences between day and night, but the carnival itself does seem to suggest that they are being mixed, going beyond just what Shakespeare came up with. And here it is, mentioning it again, which brings me to this girl. Initially, I was confused as to why this girl who we saw at the same time as Enhypen and the werewolves is still in her uniform from the night before and still clutching the invitation, and yet still manages to arrive just so incredibly late to this party. Especially since, like, everyone else around her seemed to get there on time and totally fine. But what if she isn't really late? What if this is a reality where it's just that? Day and night coexisting. It's a thought I want to leave you on anyway, since we, of course, can't have a direct answer. That would be ridiculous. I also wanted to remind you that this image exists from their last album, which referenced the carnival and had words on the sign that said, "Don't be last." It could also say, "Don't be lost." It's kind of hard to read because it happens to be covered by like a branch, but I think it can apply either way because technically she could have gotten lost on her way there. and you don't want to be lost. The fate of this girl is suddenly becoming very interesting, but more on that later. Hi, I'm just popping in to clarify something because I think it was a little bit confusing the way that I explained it, but this could be an alternate reality that happens in a wormhole space. There are probably other multiple realities that like parallel this situation, which is something we keep seeing in the past and we'll see in the future. So even if it doesn't directly seem to connect to this in the future, that's because it happens through an alternate reality in a wormhole. I do think that this particular reality that we're following is the actual reality that they want us to follow, possibly like the alpha timeline, the alpha reality. Not exactly sure how that works yet. They haven't shown us all that they need to show us about wormholes, but yeah, just wanted to say that before we move on to the next section. Okay, back to the video. Let's look at some of the other interesting things that are going on in this video now that we understand the main purpose of this carnival. Now, I have previously talked about how back in Give and Taken, it seemed like Jay and Jake were having a standoff of sorts. And I predicted that for some reason, these two would fight each other and maybe cause the rest of the group to fight. This music video continues that narrative for me, and it starts to give me hints of details to make it more clear on why and how this fight is going to happen. This all starts the moment that Jungwon appears to blow out the candles on the cake. The placement here is really interesting because, let's see, usually, if I was with my friends and I was gonna blow out the candles on a birthday cake, you'd kind of put the cake down on the table and, you know, everyone would be in a circle around it watching, or at least like crowded, you know, or if you're gonna at least stand to hold it, everyone would be like circling around the cake because the cake is kind of the contender here, right? That's not what they're doing here, but they did in fact do it in the past. Yet, here in their present storyline, some of them aren't even bothering to look at the cake between them in favor of staring at each other without expression. You could almost consider this a glare. It really reminds me of the scene in Give and Taken, with the tension which is almost palpable, not even being broken by the appearance of Jungwon. The people on the left side are Sungwoon, Jae, and Nikki, and on the right are Jake, Heesung, and Sunwoo. Jungwon does stand in the middle, which makes me think he might have a more neutral stance on things. However, he was at the bus stop at the beginning of the music video with Heesung and Jake, so maybe not, because Heesung and Jake are on the same side. Speaking of Jake, as I said before, Jake and Jae were on opposite sides before, and that is still the case, even though they're not actually necessarily heading each other off in this one. Instead, Jake seems to be more interested in contesting Nikki, while Sungwoon and Sunwoo are facing each other. Considering that these two were the ones that were featured with blood at the end, I think this pair-off makes sense. Also, because I get the feeling that Sunwoo is kind of just off doing his own thing, maybe without the others knowing. And of course, as I mentioned before, I do think this is because he's aiming for the throne, which we'll talk about in a minute. By the way, a throne was the cover of the Dusk version of the previous album. And interestingly, in fact, Nikki is seen sitting on a throne in the choreography for this song, which ties to my previous theory that Nikki is actually the most powerful of them all, despite maybe not actually having the fortitude for it yet. To add to that, Sunwoo does in fact glare at Nikki in the Let Me In music video right as they're entering the Red Room. And of course, while he's not looking at Nikki here, they are still on opposite sides. Another interesting aspect is that Heesung and Sunwoo are on the same side as well, considering that in Let Me In, we do see Heesung hit Sunwoo, which feels to me like Sunwoo might turn on the others, and considering we do see him acting on his own in this music video a lot, that might actually be the case. Especially since, while Jake is standing on the same side as Sunwoo, Jake himself is actually actively trying not to become drunk in this music video, similarly to Sunwoo himself, because he is seen dumping out the drink with the red blood in it. This is also reflected in the teasers for the Hype version of this album, where his intro was the only one bathed in a blue light instead of being corrupted by the blood red color that permeates everyone else's. By the way, the whole drunk thing is clearly the point of this party, like to get drunk. I mean, you know, forgetting the vampire part. I mean, the walls literally say, "Only in blood we breathe," which, you know, is clearly what is actually making them feel drunk. And of course we see the phrase, "too young to live, too drunk to die," which fans of Panic at the Disco will probably recognize, because one of their albums is named Too Weird to Live, Too Rare to Die, which in itself is actually a reference to a book, which is called Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas. And interestingly enough, the book actually has similar themes to Enhypen in the fact that they actually are two dudes on basically a drug trip. If you're interested in reading it or at least seeing the book, I highly recommend just looking it up because it's definitely thematically related. But I digress. Why are they even facing off here in the first place? What has changed over their centuries of living that has caused this divide to happen? I think this has to do with the whole purpose of the carnival in the first place. Not the drunk part this time, but like, you know, the vampire part. As we've already figured out, the carnival was of course created to create vampires. As the Choose Chosen debut trailer suggested, vampires are, or at least were, revered, looked at as gods, much like the image of the woman that we see in this music video. Even if this event only happens once every 100 years or so, you know, every time they decide to add another birthday candle to their cake, just like turning everyone into an immortal vampire isn't really conducive to, you know, being revered to as a god or being worshipped. Like, how are you supposed to, if everyone's on the same playing field, you know, then you just, no one is a god anymore. And thus, this is where I believe their divide comes from. In the beginning of the music video, we see Jake, Heesung, and Jungwon leaving behind an invitation to their party to be found, as if they're searching for people to attend, and clearly it does work. And as we see later, Sunu does in fact complete this ritual of blood flowing through the fountain as it has always been done. Not surprisingly, if we ignore Jungwon for just a second, who is probably neutral, Heesung, Jake, and Sunu are all on the same side, the side that wishes to turn more people into vampires. However, as I mentioned before, not really helpful in the whole being worshipped thing. And, sorry, who did we see sitting on the throne in the choreography again? That's right, Nikki. Nikki, who has been referenced as having enough power to warrant being literally chained to the wall so that he doesn't use it. On his side, we see Sungwoon, who at the end of the video does indeed bathe in the blood that drips down, and has been previously shown as being one of the more dangerous members in terms of showcasing powers and just generally holding weapons. Likewise, in Give and Taken, he was actually the one who had the word fate behind him written in blood, so his fate was literally written in blood. And while we have yet to see what Jay is capable of, I do wonder if perhaps he doesn't really want to turn more people into vampires. I always kind of felt like he was almost anti-vampire. He doesn't really use his powers that often. Even here, he isn't really actively using his powers, and previously he just never really demonstrates it. Generally, I believe the goal of the people in this group, for the most part, is to rule over everyone. But even so, they do, you know, attend the party. They still end up turning people into vampires probably, which of course was the, like, main reasoning for getting together and doing the whole carnival thing anyway. Their bloody birthday party, as they call it. So if they know that this is gonna happen, why is Sunu being so suspicious about it? Of course, there is the thought that he wants to lure the werewolves over to him and of course get them away from whatever is going to happen inevitably at that party. And he is clearly expecting this because he turns around and is not surprised to see Kay behind him at all. But as I mentioned, we see no resolution to this particular line of thought, and Sunu doesn't seem to be bothered at all because he continues with his actual goal, which was of course to pour the blood in the fountain. So clearly they've reached at least some form of agreement, because I doubt that he killed Kay, but I believe this is actually because of Sunu's own ambitions. He wants to rule not only over the humans, but also over other vampires. So of course he wants to create more vampires that he can rule over, and of course use to his own ends. And perhaps this is why he uses his own blood. It's possible that this gives them some sort of power over other people or something like that, or that there's actually a deeper meaning to this that we just don't know yet and haven't seen. After all, it's unclear what became of the woman who turned them, only that she's not really there or present at the moment. Of course, she could technically be somehow related to the girl that we see, but that has yet to be shown. Regardless, of course, the story here is just getting started. So speaking of the story, let's just take a detour and talk about that for a second. Dark Moon and the Hybe universe. As we see in the description of the music video, Drunk-Dazed is the first music video to be a part of the Dark Moon storyline, which is of course the newest story in the Hybe universe. It's important to note that this doesn't mean that previous music videos aren't part of the story, they're just not directly telling the story. So this music video is telling us the story, and the other ones are simply referencing it. This becomes really clear because, of course, they actually directly reference Give and Taken in this music video, meaning Give and Taken has to, you know, relate to the storyline. It's just not the storyline. Does that make sense? Likewise, in addition to the fact that Enhypen is part of the Dark Moon story, it's probable that they're going to be adding other people into this particular story as well. For example, Kay and EJ, who were also other contestants on Island, which was the show that formed Enhypen. And of course, they're set to debut with the big hit Japan group, which is rumored to be called And Team. That is not confirmed, that is just a rumor. So they could be incorporated into the storyline. By the way, there was a lot of rumors going around that Taki was the guy sitting on the couch, but someone from my Discord server actually did end up finding the Instagram of the model that they used in the background of this particular shot, and he is not Taki. So the only ones who were in this music video for sure are Kay and EJ. I just wanted to clear that up, because there was probably some form of scheduling issue, which is why the other ones don't appear. However, it's likely that this group will have their own storyline featuring the supernatural things that are going on there. Maybe they're not all werewolves, for example. And I can't wait to watch that because, you know, we don't even see what happens to them. What do they do? What can they do? We don't know. We just sort of saw them turn into werewolves. Like, is that what delays the girl? We're not sure. Speaking of the girl, she might actually be part of the new girl group that Source Music is going to be making. And there's one very strong reason why I believe this to be the case. Because one of the Plus Global auditions, which was meant to form this girl group, was actually called, wait for it, Invitation. And the first thing we see of this girl is her picking up the invitation. I don't know about you, but that just feels more and more likely the more I think about it. So why am I mentioning this? What does this have to do with Enhypen? Well, this sets forth some new possibilities within the Hybe universe in general. It establishes that everything is happening in the same time and space, which has never been confirmed before. Previously, it's always been world-building things, like the cat, for example, and time travel, and how time travel works. Like, do BTS and TXT's timelines interact at all? Are they several years apart that they're happening? It could be. Are TXT famous in BTS's storyline? I don't know. My point is, it's really hard to say, and it's never been able to be confirmed before. But in this situation, which is very exciting and very new, we now see for sure that these members are taking part in this storyline. So possibly Enhypen and Team, if that's what they decide to go with, and the new girl group might actually all be taking place in the same storyline, in the same timeline, in the same place. And it does make me wonder if they're all going to be part of this particular story. So Dark Moon, for example, and this storyline is going to have with Enhypen, or Dark Moon with And Team, or Dark Moon with the new girl group. Because it's possible they can use that name of that storyline because it's the same narrative, or they can give them another one because it'll be obviously from a different perspective in each one. The reason I'm thinking this is because they specifically decided to name it Dark Moon and not Blood Moon like what Enhypen is constantly talking about. And werewolves are known to be the strongest, of course, on the full moon, but a dark moon would be the opposite, the new moon. So there's a lot of implications in that if they do decide to name it the same, and they're just taking place with different perspectives and stuff like that, which could be really fun and really interesting. Also, the name Dark Moon probably refers to the shadow. Thank you, Carl Jung. In fact, the whole music video of Drunk-Dazed does seem to feel like it's highlighting the elements of the shadow and what the shadow would want. The party, to be without a care, to be timeless, the idea of infecting or spreading their vampirism, to give in to temptation from the taste of that sweet, sweet blood. It's all shadow wants. It's not something that you necessarily want to show to other people that you are proud of and would display in society, thus it becomes your shadow, right? Likewise, since the carnival is actually about concealing your shadow behind a mask, a persona, I think that this party can in fact literally be a mask for their true intentions, which was in this case to turn them into vampires. And it reveals their inner darkness, which is drenched in blood, literally. Interestingly, this connection to the shadow, and of course the connection to the other groups, one of which competed on the same reality show as them, immediately brings us to the final portion of this video, the idol industry, and all of the shadows that come with it. Now, Enhypen has been criticizing the idol industry and its objectification since before their debut. The show, Island itself, actually weirdly sort of showcased everything that could possibly be criticized It fell really easily into the, like, competitive idol genre, and this was likely intentional. You could, in theory, during the show, watch the boys at, like, all times. They had cameras everywhere. You could always see what they were up to. Weird and a little bit creepy. And their pre-debut photos after being chosen did have them actually holding cameras as if they were, like, aware of the fact that the camera was always there. And that even now continues with the idea that they're, like, on a show and they're products meant to be consumed. But with the arrival of their first album and their music videos, we got images of them literally tied to the practice room walls, indicating their entrapment and the weight of the expectations that fans are putting on them, that expectation of perfection. And in Let Me In, they were literally objects to be observed behind glass in a museum. They're literally being objectified and looked upon as objects. Perfectly captured moments that sold the idea of the perfect boyfriend for fans to consume for their liking. With the arrival of this album, that did not stop. You only have to look as far as the lyrics in their song Mixed Up to see this. It talks about the constant bombardment of notifications, the words of gossip, and the want thrown towards them in which they become the main character, completely out of their own control. Along with the feeling of wanting to be left alone, they also incorporate the idea of border, the name of their album, into this as well by saying there are fans that cross the border, cross the boundaries and go too far. This continues in Not For Sale as well, although a little bit more subtly. In the choreography for this song, it literally has them being like items on a store shelf, clothing hanging off of a rack, items to be consumed yet again. It ignores their obvious humanity, which is a little ironic and probably intentional because they aren't even human in their storyline. They're vampires. This notion does not escape my attention. Like, that is definitely something that they purposefully did. They're like, oh, vampires look like humans, but they're not humans. And similarly, the treatment of idols, you know, they're actually humans, but people don't look at them and treat them like a human. My point is, of course, it's totally okay to support your idols. They love to perform, and obviously they're doing what they want to do. They want to be singers, they want to be dancers and perform for fans, and they work hard to get to where they are. But there are definitely boundaries, and I implore you to remember that idols are humans too, despite sometimes appearing to be on a throne or appearing to be a product that the company only wants to sell you. Anyways, thank you guys so much for watching. I hope that you enjoyed this video and maybe you can understand a little bit more about Enhypen's universe or the Hybe universe and the message that they're trying to share with us. If you liked this video, please make sure to give it a thumbs up and make sure to subscribe with notifications turned on so that YouTube tells you every single time that I post a video. All of my social media is linked in the description below, and of course I wanted to give a shout out to my patrons over on Patreon. Thank you guys so much for your support. I would not be able to do this without you. Thank you guys so much for watching. As it is, stay sunny. Bye! The Fever music video is coming out in like a day, and this video is so late, so hopefully this mostly holds up, but we're gonna have to see.